I haven't done anything yet. So, like the man says, I want to do kind of a different kind of talk today. I was listening to the program as we're talking about the program today, and it's just amazingly impressive, the range of talks we have and the depths of talks that we have at this conference, and how much of the technology we're really digging into here. But what I really want to talk about today, really the topic of my talk, is less about the how and more about the why. Why do we do this? Why do we spend these hours pounding on these keyboards? So here's what I'm going to do. I'm actually going to tell you a story. It is a story that is really close to my heart. It is a story that I think is a fun story. So if nothing else, we'll sort of have some fun this morning, maybe wake up a little bit from the party last night and get going for today. But I also think it's a story that can inform us, that has lessons for us for the things we do every day in our work, in little ways and in great big ways. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to tell you this story. I'm just going to tell you a story. And then I'm going to circle back at the end and try and make the case that this story is relevant to the things we do and how we do them, but more particularly why we do the things that we do in little ways and in great big ways. So here goes. Here's my story. It's the summer of 1969, and it's hot. I mean, it's really hot. And when it gets hot like this, it seems like the whole world goes a little crazy. People go a little crazy. And here in the summer of 1969, it certainly seems like the world is going crazy. Certainly Western society seems to be coming apart at the seams. In the United States, there are huge and growing and sometimes violent protests against the Vietnam War. In France, the whole country has at times shut down as people protest, wanting a better education, a more responsive government, just a better society. In the UK, it strikes. Whole industries are just walking off the job. Hospital nurses and the people who generate electricity, it just seems like the whole world is going crazy. And you would think that with everything going so crazy that maybe you could get away, take a holiday, jump in your car and drive to the beach or to the country. But that's getting harder to do too, because have you seen the price of gasoline? Here in the summer of 1969, the price of oil and gasoline, petrol, has been going up and up and up and up for years, so that now, here in the summer of 1969, it can cost $5 to fill up your car with gasoline. And if it's not the price of gasoline or the prices of things or the civil unrest, it's also the pace of change. Here in the summer of 1969, those rare and very strange people who work with computers have had to learn a new word. That word is megabyte. They've had to learn this new word because there's now a computer. You can now buy a computer that has 4 megabytes. And that memory will only cost you $100,000 per megabyte. It's just crazy. But if you want real crazy, if you want serious crazy, you need to look no further than the Cold War. Here in the summer of 1969, the Cold War has been going on for 25 years. For 2.5 decades, there's been us, Western Europe, the United States on one side, and them, the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, some other countries on the other side. And we have been staring at each other for 25 years. The guns have been pointed at each other. Both sides waiting for the other side to make the first move or make the first mistake or to sneeze. And you better hope nobody sneezes, because they have thousands of nuclear weapons. We have thousands of nuclear weapons, and if those bombs start flying, we all have about 10 or 15 minutes to live. So here in the summer of 1969, we are holding on by our fingernails, living life 10 or 15 minutes at a time. But for once, it's not the Cold War, it's not the price of oil, it's not anything else that's filling up all the newspapers. For once, it's something different. It's Apollo, the program to land a person on the moon. It's just all over the news. But don't get me wrong, Apollo is all about the Cold War. You see, in the late 1950s and the early 1960s, the Soviets were doing absolutely amazing things in space. They launched the first Earth satellite, just incredible. They put the first person in orbit, unbelievable. They got the first picture of the far side of the moon. It was a brilliant achievement. Really crappy picture, but still. So the Cold War was like a chess game, right? They make a move, we have to respond. And so they were doing all these things in space. And if you're engaged in this multi-decade conflict where you're going all around the world and you're saying, be on our side, we're the smart ones, we're going to win, you can't afford to have the other side do spectacular things and not respond. So particularly the Americans had to respond. And so John Kennedy was president back then, and he got his advisors together to figure out what we were going to do, and they came up with a strategy. And their strategy was based on the idea that if you're in a race and you're behind, it's better to be behind in a long race, in a marathon, than it is to be behind in a short race, like a sprint. Because if you're behind in a marathon, there's time to catch up. It's a long race. So Kennedy just decided to declare a marathon. He got his advisors together and he said, where can we go in space that's really far away, that'll make this like a marathon? His advisor said, well, the moon's pretty far away. He said, fine, we're going to the moon. It's this completely arbitrary goal. And we need a deadline. We need a stake in the calendar. 1970 is a nice round number. We're going to the moon by 1970. It's a completely arbitrary goal, completely arbitrary deadline. No one in this room has ever experienced that, have you? So Kennedy got up in front of the US Congress and he said, we are going to take a person from the Earth, send them to the moon, land them on the moon, and bring them back to the Earth before 1970. And a funny thing happened after Kennedy made that speech. Funny thing happened is people started looking at each other. And they would say, wait, well, we all know this is all about the Cold War. We all understand that. But we are going to the moon. Who cares if it's about the Cold War? This is H.G. Wells and Jules Verne. We are going to the moon. And you could tell that Kennedy actually got some of the enthusiasm because a few months after he made that first speech, he made a second speech. And in the second speech, he said words to the effect, we choose to go to the moon, not because it's easy, but because it's hard. Well, how hard is it to go to the moon? Well, it really depends on how far the moon is, how far away it is. And so, whenever you talk about astronomical sizes and distances, you need a little analog. So here's mine. This is a tennis ball. And if this tennis ball is the size of the Earth, then I've got this little rubber ball. This is about the right size for the moon. So now I want you to imagine every diagram you've ever seen about how the phases of the moon work or lunar eclipses, that kind of thing. There's always this diagram where there's the Earth and the moon, and they're about this far apart. You know that diagram? You've seen it 100 times. Well, I have to tell you, that diagram is more about getting the Earth and the moon on the same page. The Earth and the moon are not this far apart. They are not this far apart. They're not this far apart. My arms aren't long enough. They'd be about 2 meters at this scale. Moon's really far away. And here's the thing. When Kennedy said we're going to the moon, people had started going up into space. Few Russians, one American. Do you know how far they had gotten into space? Not quite as far as the fuzz on this tennis ball. We hadn't made it out of the fuzz yet, and suddenly we're going 2 meters by an arbitrary deadline. It's just an insane project. It was a crazy idea, crazy hard. And if you have this insane project with this impossible deadline, what's the right way to start? What's the right way to get this going if you have this insane deadline? I don't know what the right way is, but I do know what they did. They did everything all at the same time. They thought up everything they might possibly need to do to get people to the moon, and they started doing them all at the same time. And the prayer was that all of these separate projects would all come together and work together at the last minute, because that's always a good plan. So one of the things they did was to try and think, well, what is the simplest thing that we can possibly do to start out? To get this thing started, we'll do the simplest version of this that we possibly can. So the goal is to take a person, land them on the moon, and return them to the Earth. How can we make that simpler, something that we could do right now? Well, you think about it for a minute. The obvious thing is to leave the person out of the equation, right? That's got to be simpler. No air and food and all that kind of stuff. So how about if we take a robotic spaceship, a machine, and just send it and land it on the moon and return it safely to the Earth? That has got to be simpler than having a person, but is it the simplest thing we could possibly do? No. If you're just sending a machine and landing it on the moon, there is no reason to bring it back, so just leave it there. That's got to be simpler. Good. Is that the simplest thing we could possibly do? Not quite. We need to talk about what this word land means. What if we redefine land to mean go screaming in at 2.4 kilometers per second, splat? That's landing of a sort, and we could take some pictures on the way, watch the moon get closer and closer and closer till the lights go out. Thus was born Project Ranger, a project to hit the moon with a spaceship. And Ranger 1 was launched in August of 1961, and it's kind of a funny project, right? The goal is to crash the spaceship. So Ranger 1, by those standards, Ranger 1 succeeded brilliantly. Ranger 1 crashed in the Atlantic Ocean. Ranger 2 did better. Ranger 2 crashed in the Pacific Ocean. Ranger 3, in all seriousness, did better. It made it all the way out to the orbit of the moon. The moon wasn't there at the time. They had a little navigation problem. One of those, was that supposed to be a minus sign or a plus sign? Oops. So Ranger 3 is still out there somewhere. Let's see, 4. Ranger 4 actually hit the moon, but Ranger 4 died electrically on the way to the moon. It had some massive failure in the electronics, and it was a brick when it looped around and hit the far side of the moon. That was success, maybe, sort of, no, not really. Let's see. 5. Ranger 5 was apparently worried about Ranger 3 and joined it in the great beyond. Ranger 6 had a textbook 3-day journey to the moon. It takes about 3 days to get to the moon. And on the morning of that third day, the people behind Ranger 6 realized that, well, neither God nor Isaac Newton was going to keep this thing from hitting the moon, and the spacecraft was working, and the only thing left to do was turn on the TV cameras and get those pictures of the moon getting closer and closer. And they turned on the TV cameras, and they failed. And so Ranger 6 crashed blind into the moon, this close. Ranger 7 actually worked. Took these pictures as it went screaming into the moon. And this last one is actually final evidence that Ranger 7 fulfilled its destiny, because it took the picture and it was radioing the picture back, and it got about halfway through radioing the picture back when the lights went out. So you can imagine when this picture came back, the people behind Ranger 7 were slapping each other on the back and maybe having some champagne, celebrating. But you can also imagine they were thinking, my God, it took us 2 years and 7 tries to do the simplest thing that could possibly work. How are we going to do the whole thing? And the answer is, they kept doing everything at the same time. So one of the other things they realized early on was they were building these gigantic going-to-the-moon rockets. But those gigantic going-to-the-moon rockets would not be ready in time to train the astronauts and train the people at Mission Control in the things that you needed to know to go to the moon. So they built a whole separate spaceship called Gemini, which would take 2 people up in the Earth orbit, still inside the fuzz on the tennis ball, to train them in the thing, going to the moon skills. And they learned a lot in Gemini. One of the things they learned is about the little steering rockets. Every spaceship has these little steering rockets. It's the kind of thing that makes it nose up or turn left or right. It's the kind of thing that airplanes do with ailerons and a rudder, but there's no air in space, so you use these little rockets to move the thing around. What they learned was what happens if one of those little steering rockets malfunctions and starts to fire and will not stop firing. And the answer is that your spaceship starts to tumble, slowly at first, but faster and faster and faster. And they also learned that when that happens, the people inside the spaceship start to have trouble seeing as the whole world is sort of spinning around them. And, the other thing that they learned was that if you have, in that situation, an astronaut who is so calm that he can work the problem while his spaceship is spinning out of control, and he can find the right switches to throw, even though he can't see what he's doing, this is a survivable accident. And survive they did. That is something to know. While all this is going on, while they're trying to hit the moon with Rangers, while they're sending people up in Gemini, they are building these huge workshops. And they're building these huge workshops so they will have a place to build these gigantic going-to-the-moon rockets. And the end result of that is this. For its time, this is the largest rocket ever built. It stands 26 stories tall, it weighs 3.5 million kilograms, and it really only has one purpose. The purpose of this whole huge thing is to throw the very pointy bit at the top, the very pointy part, all the way up the top. You can barely see it in this picture, see it better there. Throw that at the moon. Because the very pointy bit at the top is the result of yet another project. This is the Apollo mothership. It is a spaceship designed to take 3 people safely to the moon and back home. It has the food and the oxygen and the heat and the shielding you need to keep 3 people alive for 2 weeks. It has a big rocket engine to blast them back to the Earth. It has a heat shield and a parachute to get them through re-entry. And since it lands in the ocean, it can act as a boat. It is a brilliant piece of 1960s technology, and there's only 2 things wrong with it. Thing number 1 is it killed its first crew. They weren't even flying in space. They were just sitting on the launch pad. Let's sit on the launch pad and pretend that we're launching in practice. And a fire broke out inside the spaceship. 3 times the ground crew tried to fight their way in to get those people out. 3 times the flames and the smoke and the heat drove them back. On the 4th try, they got the hatch open, but there was nobody left to save. But here in the summer of 1969, we think we've got all those problems fixed. We're not 100% sure because we're in a huge hurry, but we think we fixed the fire problems in this thing. That's problem number 1. Problem number 2 is that this thing with the heat shield and the parachutes and the big rocket engine and everything else is actually too heavy to land on the moon. It can go from the Earth to the moon, it can orbit around the moon, and it can come back, but it can't make that last 50 or 60 kilometer journey down to the moon. It's just too heavy. So for that, we have this. This bizarre-looking machine is a specialized spaceship that's designed to take 2 of the 3 astronauts. So one of them gets left behind on the mothership, and 2 of them get in this thing and fly down to the surface of the moon. They hang out for a little while, and then they fly back up, and then everybody goes home on the mothership. This is actually a fairly complicated spaceship. It's actually a 2-stage rocket. There's a fuel tank and engine for landing, and a separate fuel tank and engine for taking off. And that's only important because if you change your mind while you're landing, there's actually a fairly complicated process you have to go through to switch over so that you can go back up, and you'll see why that's important in a minute. So the plan is for this thing with two people, these two spaceships, to go out to the moon carrying these guys. The guy closest to me is Buzz Aldrin, and he's one of the two people who are actually going to try and land on the moon. Buzz Aldrin is an expert in spacesuits and space navigation. So keep breathing and don't miss the moon. Can you imagine why they picked him for this thing? The guy on the far end is the other guy who's actually going to try and land on the moon, and he's Neil Armstrong, and we've already met Neil Armstrong. Neil Armstrong was the guy in that out-of-control spaceship who managed to work the problem without being able to see what he's doing. Can you imagine why they picked him? The guy in the middle is Michael Collins, and he's the guy who's going to stay on the mothership, and he's got the suckiest job in the world, in the universe. His job isn't just sucky because he doesn't get to land on the moon. His job is also sucky because of the what-ifs. What if something happens to the other two on the way down to the moon? What if something happens to them on the moon? What if they can't get back? Collins' job in those cases is to turn around and leave his friends behind and make the 3-day silent, sad journey back home. That has got to be the suckiest job in the world. It is July 20th, 1969. It's a Sunday. It's about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. A few days ago, Apollo 11 took off. This huge rocket worked, and they've been on their way to the moon ever since. A few hours ago, the two spaceships separated. The mothership stayed in orbit with Collins. Armstrong and Aldrin got in this thing and have been on their way down to the moon for the last couple of hours. They are about to enter the last critical 10 minutes of the journey down to the surface of the moon, a part of the mission that NASA calls powered descent. Back on Earth, in Mission Control, there's a room full of people arming for war. Their job is to watch the data streaming down from this weird-looking spaceship and be the third, fourth, fifth, 27th pair of eyes, making sure that that weird machine is working correctly. Many of these people have spent a substantial portion of their adult lives getting ready for this moment. They've got the door locked. There's an armed guard on the other side of the door. No one is getting in or getting out until this thing is over. They've locked down the circuit breakers on a lot of their electrical equipment. They would rather risk a fire than have lights go out at the wrong time. Outside of Mission Control, in various places in the world, but especially in the United States, there is this blanket of tension everywhere. The streets are strangely empty. There's very few cars on the streets because most people are inside, glued to their TV, glued to the coverage, watching what's going on above the moon. It's right around now, it's right around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, that something weird starts to happen to the cars that are on the road. They start to pull off. On city streets, they find a place to park. On highways, they pull off onto the shoulder. On rural roads, they just stop. The drivers can't drive and listen to their radios, listen to what's going on above the moon at the same time. In this very modest house in Philadelphia, state of Pennsylvania, there is a 10-year-old boy and his dad, and they're watching the coverage on TV. They're both sitting on the couch, but it's right around now, it's right around 4 o'clock in the afternoon that the dad gets up, walks about halfway to the TV, and gets down into this sort of crouch and puts his hand on his head. And that's the way he'll stay until it's over. They are watching this guy on television. This is Walter Cronkite. Walter Cronkite is the king of American television journalists. He's one of those nothing bothers him kind of people. If there's a war, you will find Cronkite getting shot at in the war, calmly telling the people back home what it's like to get shot at in a war. Many people remember Cronkite years ago as the very calm voice with just a touch of sadness in it that told the world that John Kennedy, the president, had been assassinated. It is 4 or 5 p.m. It's right at the beginning of that last 10-minute flight down to the surface of the moon. Armstrong and Aldrin are at 15 kilometers. They've gone through about a quarter of their fuel to get there, and things are not really going that well. The problem is that their radio is not really working. They can talk to the ground, they can talk to mission control for a few seconds at a time, but then they get these huge blasts of static, and they don't know where the static is coming from. And even worse, it's not just the voice, it's all the data is dropping out, and they need that second, third, fourth, 27th pair of eyes looking at the data. And so Armstrong and Aldrin, they have their heads down and they're doing the things that you do to make a radio work. So they're changing channels and they're adjusting the antenna. And fortunately, they have time to do that because they are not actually flying the spaceship. There is a new technology that's flying the spaceship. It is called a computer. And the reason they have a computer is that they are not just trying to land anywhere on the moon. They are trying to land at a particular, very carefully studied, carefully selected spot on the moon. Now, when they were planning the mission, there was a lot of controversy over where they should land. On the one side, there were the scientists and the geologists, the people who study the moon. And they were saying, sure, we know this all about the Cold War, but it's also the scientific opportunity of a lifetime. We have got to land someplace geologically interesting. And on the other side, there were the astronauts and the engineers and the rocket scientists, and they were like, fine, what's geologically interesting? And the scientists would think, and they would say, the floor of a valley would be nice, but the bottom of a canyon would be better. How about the top of a mountain? Yeah, the top of a mountain would be great. No, the rim of a crater. To which the astronauts and the rocket scientists respond, have you lost your mind? We are not landing at any of those places. And in the end, it was the astronauts and the rocket scientists who won the argument because this was about the Cold War, and you're not going to win the Cold War with your little spaceship sliding down the side of a mountain, are you? So the computer that is flying Apollo 11 is flying Apollo 11 to the flattest, dullest, most geologically uninteresting spot on the moon that NASA can find. It is 4:10 p.m., about 5 minutes into that 10-minute flight. Armstrong and Aldrin are at 11 kilometers. They've gone through about half their fuel, and good news, the radio starts working. As mysteriously as the radio problems start, they just go away. And you've got to believe that Armstrong and Aldrin, they're maybe thinking to themselves, well, maybe that was our problem. Something has to go wrong. Maybe that was it. And maybe it's going to go well from here. When a display lights up in front of them, it's just got a number, 1202. 1202 is a message from their computer. And I know no one is sort of familiar with ancient computers and all that kind of stuff. So let me see if I can translate 1202 into something any civilized, educated person, and even a lot of uneducated people in the world would recognize. And if not that, maybe that. You're a bunch of programmers, maybe that. Computer crashed. Armstrong gets on the radio, and he radios down the mission control, 1202. What the heck is 1202? There's hundreds of these error codes, right? What's this one mean? The people at mission control, they have this moment of frozen horror because they don't really know what 1202 means. There's hundreds of these error codes. And there's one guy in that room. He's in his 20s. His name is Steve Bales. He's a guidance system expert, and he knows what 1202 means. He knows that 1202 means that the computer has more to do than it can actually get to. But he also knows something else. He knows that the software in that computer is designed, when this happens, to do the most important things first. And right now, there's only one important thing: fly the darn spaceship. So Bales, he has about 2 seconds to make this decision, and it's literally a life or death decision. He says, just ignore the 1202s. Just keep going. Just close your eyes and keep going. But Armstrong and Aldrin, they can't quite ignore the 1202s. For one thing, there's a bad user interface design. They have to keep pushing a button to clear the error code. And error code will show, and it will stay there until they physically push a button before they can see the next one. And they do indeed. They start pushing the button, and then they see another one, which is 1201, which means pretty much the same thing. But they have to keep pushing this button to clear these error codes, because the next one might be 867, which means the engine fell off or something. Who knows? And so they have their head down, and they are dealing with their technology, and they're pushing this button. It is 4:12 p.m., 7 minutes into that last 10 minutes of flight. Armstrong and Aldrin are down to 600 meters. They're down to 20% of their fuel. And good news, the computer starts working. Like the radio, the problem comes, and the problem just mysteriously disappears. And finally, Armstrong has a chance to look up from all this technology and look out the window. He's got this little triangular window in front of him, and he looks out the window. Now, he's at 600 meters. If you're flying into London or Copenhagen or New York, and your airplane is at 600 meters, you're almost there. You're getting ready to land. The landing gear is down. The flaps are down. Your tray table is up. The plane is, doing this. At 600 meters, you can look out the window and see the trees. You can see if the traffic is barred by the airport. At 600 meters, New York is no longer the place where the office is, or the place you're going next week, or where the conference is, or any of that. At 600 meters, New York is a place. It's all around you. At 600 meters, Armstrong looks out the window, and for the first time in human history, the moon is no longer that light up in the sky. It's no longer this geopolitical, we are going to kick the Russians' butts by getting there first. It's not this thing that he's been training for years. It's a place. It's all around him. He can look down and he can see the ground scrolling beneath him, and there's rocks and boulders and craters. He can look in the distance and he can see the horizon, and on the horizon there's mountains, and the mountains are higher than he is. Now, when I was a kid, I would sometimes try to imagine what it would have been like to be him at that moment, looking out that window. Imagine you're in this big spacesuit looking out that window. And nobody knows what Armstrong felt at that moment, but I'm pretty sure I know what I would have felt. And what I would have felt was terror. The moon is a place. It's the wrong place. Armstrong has been studying photographs and maps. They made plaster models. He knows exactly what he should see when he looks out that window, and this is not it. And then it gets worse, because on that window, there's these little markings, and Armstrong can line his eye up with the right marking and look down and line up and see where the computer is taking him to land. And so Armstrong does that. He lines up on the right marking, and he looks down, and he sees that. A very geologically interesting crater. Armstrong looks at that for just a few seconds, and then he makes a very Neil Armstrong decision. He makes a very Neil Armstrong decision. He turns off the autopilot, and he kills most of their downward descent, so they're not falling anymore, and he guns it forward. He does that because he thinks he can see past the crater, and it's not just the crater. The crater isn't that big, but the crater is surrounded by this debris field. Remember what a crater is, right? Big rock comes down, boom. There's stuff all over the place. And this particular crater is surrounded by a field of boulders the size of cars. So Armstrong kills their downward descent and starts zooming forward because he thinks he can see at the end of the boulders, just on the other side of the boulders, he thinks he can see a decent place to land, and he has got to get there before they run out of fuel. People at Mission Control, all this data is streaming down. They can see Armstrong turn off the computer. They can see him changing course and deviating from the plan. The one thing they can't see is the boulders, because there's no live video feed. All they know is that Armstrong has deviated from the plan, and they know something else. They've been watching his heart rate. And they watch Armstrong's heart rate go from 80, which is maybe what yours is right now. I mean, he's just landing on the moon, right? No big deal. His heart rate goes from 80, 85 to 150. They see all this in mission control, and their reaction to it is extraordinary. What they do is absolutely nothing. And in fact, they shut up. The guy running the show at Mission Control, a guy named Gene Kranz, tells everyone in that room he doesn't want anybody talking to the astronauts anymore. All he wants them to do is send up one bit of information periodically. How much time do they have left? How much time before they run out of fuel? It is 4:14 p.m., 9 minutes into that 10-minute last bit of flight. Armstrong and Aldrin are down to 100 meters. They're down to 5% of their fuel, and they are zooming across this boulder field. And they can see the far edge of the boulder field getting closer and closer and closer. They don't know how fast they're going because their speedometer is pegged. It's all the way to the max. No one ever imagined they'd be going this fast, this close to the ground. But they can see the boulder field. They're getting over the boulder field, and they can see that maybe it is a good place to land, just past the boulders. It's 4:16 p.m., 11 minutes into the 10-minute flight. Armstrong and Aldrin are down to 10 meters and 3% of their fuel, and they're past the boulders, and Armstrong picks out a relatively flat piece of ground and jams on the brakes to get this thing to stop so he can lower it the last little bit vertically. As he's doing that, the first warning comes up from Mission Control. It's just 2 words: 60 seconds. You have 1 minute of fuel left. Armstrong barely hears them, because now he's lowering the thing down, and he's sort of feeling for the ground because he can't really see it anymore because their rocket engine is blowing up this huge cloud of dust, but he knows the ground is down there somewhere. And as he's doing that, the second warning comes up from the ground. Again, it's just 2 words: 30 seconds. For God's sake, land. Armstrong is still feeling his way down. Aldrin looks out the window and says that he can see a shadow. It's the shadow of the spaceship on the ground. They are really close now. And then Aldrin looks down at his instrument panel, and there's a little amber light on his instrument panel, and it's labeled contact. And as he looks at it, it comes on. It's the contact light. Contact light means that the sensors on the landing gear of this weird-looking machine have touched something hard. Contact light means they've landed. Contact light means that these 2 guys are not going to die, and better, they're not going to fail. Contact light means that Armstrong and Aldrin, all those people back at Mission Control, all of NASA, the United States of America, that humanity has arrived. It is 4:17:41 p.m., but Armstrong and Aldrin are not quite done. The plan had been for them to turn off the rocket engine maybe half a meter above the ground and let the thing fall the rest of the way, but they were too busy not dying to do that. And so they're sitting on the ground with this rocket engine firing, burning the last of their fuel, throwing up rocks and dust and what have you, and they need to shut down this dangerous machine full of explosives very carefully. And so they have a long checklist that they go through, and they do it together. One will do the thing, and the other one will check it. They pair astronaut. And so Armstrong starts by saying shut down, and then Aldrin says, okay, ACA out of D10, and Armstrong says out of D10 auto, and they go through this long technological mumbo-jumbo of jargon as they're shutting this machine down. Meanwhile, back on Earth, the people at Mission Control, all this data is streaming down. They can see the little lander has stopped moving, and they can see the systems clicking off, and they can hear Armstrong and Aldrin going through the shutdown checklist. And you would think that at a time like this, somebody would say something momentous, something historical, but it's not really how people are. So the guy on the ground radios up words to the effect, "We think you landed." Really? Duh. Really? Armstrong is still just coming to the end of the shutdown checklist. And so he clicks off the last thing. He says, engine arm off. And then he says the words that he had made up, the words that he had practiced, the words that he wanted to be the first words spoken from another world. So he says, Houston, that's where Mission Control is. Tranquility Base here. They landed in a place on the moon called the Sea of Tranquility. The Eagle, that's the name of the little spaceship, has landed. And with those words, this room full of highly disciplined, nerdy engineers with their black ties and their white shirts and their crew cuts and their pocket protectors, as a group, stand up and start shouting. You can imagine there's some shouting going on in the cars, right? What would you do? If you're pulled off on that road and listening to this, maybe you'd pound on the steering wheel a little bit, shout, and then look around to see if anybody saw you, maybe. Certainly there was some shouting going on in that house in Philadelphia. It takes the 10-year-old boy just like half a second to realize, my God, this is over. They've done it. It's real. And then he realizes that his dad is no longer in that crouch, but his dad is jumping up and down and shouting really loud, shouting louder than he's ever heard his dad shout before. And then the boy realizes it's not just his dad who's shouting, it's the people next door, and it's the people on the other side, and it's the people across the street, it's the people on the back street. The whole neighborhood is shouting. And it's the kind of noise that you don't actually hear so much as you feel in your stomach, and it comes in waves. It'll be really loud, and then it'll trail off, and you think it's going to end. But no, then it gets really loud again. And then amidst all the shouting, the boy focuses back on the television and sees the second incredible thing of the day. Because there on TV, he saw it. He was sure he saw it. The camera cut away, but he saw it. It was real. He saw it. There on TV, just for a second, was Walter Cronkite crying. That's my story. And I say that's my story, but it's not really my story. It's your story, too. If you think about it, everything that happened, plus or minus a few politicians, everything that happened in that story, all those wonderful things, were done by people like you. They were done by people who live and breathe technology, who get up every day and just want to build the next cool thing. And if you get up every day and just want to build the next cool thing, this story, like the Soviet stories that were happening at the same time, they are part of your cultural inheritance. It's your story. But I did say that at the beginning of this that I'd try and make the case that this story is relevant to the things you do every day in little ways and great big ways. So let me try and make that case. One of the little things that I think you can pull out of this story is the importance of little things in a complicated technological project. Right? Little things in a complex system, the kind of systems that we build, can kill you. Think about all of the things that went wrong in that last 10 minutes as they were flying down to the moon. And let's talk about why those things went wrong. And I'll give you a hint. They're all caused by tiny little things. Why did the radio stop working? The radio stopped working for a while because of something that happened a few months before they took off. A few months before they took off, the rocket scientists responsible for this weird machine became concerned about the steering rockets. Remember the steering rockets? Not that they would malfunction, but that they would burn through the skin of this thing. This was a very fragile and very thin-skinned machine, and some of these steering rockets were pointed pretty close to the skin, and so they started worrying about that. So they put these little pieces of sheet metal, I've got a couple of them circled in yellow there, to deflect the rocket exhaust away from the spaceship. Turns out that those pieces of sheet metal worked great for deflecting the rocket exhaust, but they also reflected the radio signals. And at certain angles, they would screw up the radio. Little things can kill you. A few pieces of sheet metal can kill you. Why did their computer crash? Why did their computer crash? Their computer crashed because it had several modes, and you selected them with a switch. The mode that it was supposed to be in was pay attention to the moon. How high are we over the moon? How fast are we going over the moon? That was the mode that it was supposed to be in. Just pay attention to the moon. The mode that it was actually in, because they had the switch set wrong, was, pay attention to the moon, but also watch the mothership up above us. Well, that ancient computer couldn't really do both things at the same time, and so it started crashing. Little things can kill you. Piece of sheet metal, switch in the wrong place. Why were they off course? What happened? They had this perfect landing site picked out, and they missed. What happened? For that, we need to go back a few hours before the landing to when these two spaceships were hooked together. When these two spaceships were hooked together, there was a tunnel that ran between them so that the people could pass back and forth. And when they got ready to separate, they'd close the tunnel at one end, close it at the other end, pump out all the air, and then separate. Well, maybe they had something on their mind, maybe they were in a hurry, but they didn't quite pump out all the air. And so when they separated, there was a puff of air that changed the speed of the lander by 1.3 kilometers per hour. This is 1.3 kilometers per hour. I'm walking 1.3 kilometers per hour. What possible difference could 1.3 kilometers per hour make in a spaceship that's going 4,500 kilometers per hour? Well, this happened 2 hours before they landed. 1.3 kilometers per hour times 2 hours is 2.6 kilometers, the distance between the perfect landing site and the geologically interesting crater of death. Little things can kill you. A little puff of air can kill you. But there's something else to think about here. The other thing to think about is that those two spaceships between them had 2 million parts. Think about that, 2 million physical parts. If you tried to make sure that you got every detail of every one of those 2 million parts right at the beginning, well, you'd be ready to leave for the moon right around now. The trick is not to obsess over every single detail. The trick is to do something like this, to make a complex technological project succeed. The trick is to get as many of the details right as you possibly can, and then be ready to deal with the failures that do occur. That's how they got to the moon. You know what else? You know what else went into getting to the moon? Trust. These people trusted each other. Think about Steve Bales in that room, 20-something guy. Everybody turns to him and he says, just ignore the error codes. Nobody argued with him. They just went with it. They trusted him. Think about Armstrong deviating from the plan. Just throw the plan out the window and start flying manually. No one radioed up to him and said, Neil, you've turned off your targeting computer. What's the matter? They just went with it. They trusted. This thing succeeded because these people trusted each other. I think in any kind of large-scale project, trust is critical. And you know what else you need to make a project like this succeed? You need leadership, right? But in particular, you need leaders and not heroes, right? I think we have too many heroes. Here's a very heroic photograph. I looked at this photograph taken a few hours after the landing, and it grabs me. It's beautifully heroic. And that's the problem with it. This photograph looks like it was perfect. There was this trip to the moon. It was flawless. They landed. They got out. They took this beautiful photograph. They had no problems. We know that's not what happened. I like to think about the shutdown checklist. I like this better than the photograph. I like this better because these are the real words of real people trying to get the job done at the end of a really bad day. I like that. I like that these words, they're the kind of words that, when I go back to work this week, these are the kind of words that I might be spewing out, right? The same kind of incomprehensible technical jargon that I use in my daily work. It's probably the same kind of words that you use. We all, if we work in technology, we have this jargon that we talk to each other with. I like the fact that this is my kind of jargon. It's your kind of jargon. These words are our words. You know what else these words are? These are the first words spoken from another world. I like that they're real words. I like that they're not made-up words. And I like that they're my words. They're my kind of words. Which brings me to another lesson of Apollo, which I think is sort of the unexpected effects when you do something huge like this. You do something huge like this, and if it succeeds, well, great. But there's also all of these like unanticipated side effects, and the best example of that I can think of is this. See, we went to the moon, and we went to the moon to win the Cold War and maybe learn some science along the way, and a funny thing happened on the way to the moon. Funny thing happened on the way to the moon. We looked back. We looked over our shoulder. We saw ourselves. I know for most of you in this room, you've seen these pictures 1,000 times. These pictures are like part of the landscape. They're part of the wallpaper. They don't even register anymore. I would like for you to try to imagine the impact that these pictures had when they first appeared. Imagine that you had gotten to some place in your life having never seen a picture like this. And one day somebody comes and slaps it down in front of you. How would you feel? What would you say? I can tell you. You look at it and you say, Holy Mother of God, it's everything. It's all we've ever known. It is every birthday. It's every first day of school. It's every graduation. It's every first date. It's every love affair. It's every marriage. It's every wedding anniversary. It's every funeral. It's every birthday. It's all we are. It's everything we've ever known. It's all we have. It's beautiful. It's out there in the black. It's tiny. And maybe we should take care of it. There is this huge irony that Apollo, this government Cold War high-tech thing, helped inspire modern environmentalism as a mass political movement. Pictures like this coincided almost exactly with the modern environmental movement as a mass political movement, and I think it's at least partially cause and effect. You look at the picture and it just comes to you. So I think when you do something big like this, you do something difficult, you can't predict the outcome, which kind of brings me to what I think of as is the ultimate lesson of Apollo. And I think of it, it's hard for me to put it into words. I think of it mostly as a conversation between you and me. We go out to lunch, you and me, and one of us has an idea. It doesn't matter what the idea is, and it doesn't matter who had the idea. Maybe I want to get rich selling pet food on the internet. Maybe you want to invent a new programming language. Maybe I want to cure the common cold. Maybe you want to mine the seafloor for minerals. Doesn't matter what the idea is. Doesn't matter who had it. Now, you could tell me that it's a bad idea, that no one will be interested, and I might believe you. You could tell me that it's not worth the money or it's bad public policy, and sure, we could talk about it. Maybe you could talk me into that, sure. You could tell me that it's going to be bad for people, bad for the environment, that it'll make your hair fall out or give you bad teeth, and sure, we could talk about any of that. The one thing you cannot tell me is that it is not possible. I will not believe you. You see, I'm familiar with the impossible. I saw it done on TV when I was a kid. For me, the ultimate lesson of Apollo is that when you do something difficult, when you do something technically sweet, and you do it with some style and you do it with some elegance, well, you have the thing. Great, congratulations. Maybe you'll get rich. But there's this second effect from it. There is this second effect. There's this wave that goes out from it. It's a wave of belief. You make people believe. You make people believe in the possibilities. If she can do that, I can do something like that. You make people believe in the future. If he can do it, I can do it. Make people believe in themselves. I can do it. I know this for a fact. I know this for a fact because I am the result of one of those waves. I am a child of Apollo. I sat on that couch and my life changed. It got off of whatever path it was on and it got on a different path, a path that led me to the university and to engineering and then later on to computer programming and a little bit after that to writing books and a little bit after that to being here with you today. For me, the ultimate lesson of Apollo really has very little to do with the moon or space travel or rockets and any of that, and it has everything to do with believing. So for me, the ultimate lesson of Apollo goes back all those decades to the words that started it all right there in the beginning. We choose to go to the moon, not because it's easy, but because it's hard. Go do something hard. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.